Then you got traffic impact, you got school impact, and drainage mitigation, and so on.
Welcome to the BTS Presents show.
I'm Brian Schulman, I'm the producer. We're currently doing segments on Santa Cruz County and Silicon Valley real estate behind the scenes. Thanks for watching.
Hi, I'm Candace Bradfield, broker and owner of Bradfield & Associates, and past president of our Santa Cruz County Association of Realtors. I want to thank you for joining BTS Presents.
Welcome back to our show. I'm Datta Khalsa for another episode of BTS Presents Santa Cruz County and Silicon Valley Real Estate Behind the Scenes. I have with me this episode Mark Mesiti-Miller, who's a longtime community involved member and expert on housing issues. And Mark, you're here to basically educate us on COPA and how its principles are being applied here in Santa Cruz County. So thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me. COPA stands for Communities Organized for Relational Power and Action. And that is a group of 28 different institutions around Santa Cruz and Monterey counties. There are 15 members in Santa Cruz County, and collectively we work together to organize our membership, and we work on the things that are important to our membership. I'm part of the housing team. Housing is an important issue for everyone, and maybe not especially, but for everyone in our institution. So I'm part of that COPA housing team. And tonight we're really going to be talking about a civics academy, what COPA uses as a tool for educating the members of our institutions and to gather those stories about how housing, in this case, how housing is impacting families and individuals.
So you had shared with me the guiding principle for your housing team. I think that would help frame people's understanding. So that, in a nutshell, is what?
That, in a nutshell, is we support policies that make it easier, cheaper, and faster to build housing that serves the many, not the few. And when we're talking about that, we're in a sense, our litmus test is we support policies that incentivize the creation of housing, and we don't support policies that disincentivize the creation of housing.
Okay. And I guess let's go through your presentation. It starts with how housing defines your community's character and quality of life. So can you give us what a healthy community has housing for?
Yep. We believe a healthy community has housing for young and old, singles and families, service workers, professionals, public servants, and laborers.
Basically everybody.
Basically everybody, from the top to the bottom.
Okay. And if this isn't provided, you find that the community becomes what?
Becomes less diverse with respect to income, age, and ethnicity. We find that our communities are filled with more commuters.
So that leads to traffic issues because they can't afford to live where they work.
Drive till you can qualify, right? Fewer young families will be able to live in our communities, and there'll be far less economic vitality, a high job turnover, difficulty in recruiting and retaining workers.
And you've got some statistics here on Santa Cruz, the city of Santa Cruz.
Yep, this particular Civics Academy was customized for the city of Santa Cruz, and we have some statistics here that are pretty alarming. From the year 2000 through the year 2016, Santa Cruz grew by a population of 8,700. So 8,700 people moved here. Yet during that same period of time, 4,550 fewer citizens are now living here, aged 25 to 54. That is the working families. They've left our community. We also have 1,340 fewer children. But we also have a bulge here. We have 5,500 more people aged 55 to 74. No surprise, it's kind of my age group. And we have another 8,900 people that are aged 15 to 24, which is the student population, UCSC, and the young professionals, the graduates.
So we're seeing an aging population, more affluent, and the younger people are basically getting priced out. And
That's essentially what's happening. They're moving away. And so we have a community that's becoming less diverse in many respects.
what was the source of this study? Was from what, the census or?
This is Census, U.S. Census Bureau.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it goes into how you know that there's a crisis. Those points you've raised are.
Yeah, what we hear from the people in our institutions is there's a housing crisis. It's not rocket science. Everybody's aware of it. And we know that that's the case because housing, there's not adequate housing, it's not available, and it's not affordable. So that's the test. So when we talk about adequacy of our housing stock, we're talking about the physical condition and the type of housing. So do we have the housing here in our community that we actually need for the people who are living here? And is it livable? Is it actually, can we live there? And is it appropriate for the stage of life in which you find yourself? And so what we have in our community on the next slide is kind of in Santa Cruz, there's about 2 out of 3 housing units in Santa Cruz are single family homes. And that's not what our population reflects. Actually, the next slide would be better. We have 1 in 5 of our housing families have children under the age of 18. So we have 66% of our housing stock is for families, but only 20% of our population has children. 53% of our families are non-family households. So these are basically unrelated adults living together. And surprisingly, 1 in 3 units in our home are occupied by single occupants. Another 1 in 5 are households over the age of 65.
So being a university town, I would say probably that 53% figure is probably larger than most communities because of student housing is they're not a family household. Is that probably consistent in your mind?
That would be consistent. Now, there's also a large group of what we call young professionals, people that have not yet married, who are don't have the apartments they want to live in. They don't have the condominiums they want to live in. So what they're finding is they're living in houses. There's 5 or 6 young adults living together in a suburban house, and they want to be downtown, and they got to drive 1.5 miles to get downtown, and it's not working for them. But the other question is it available? Do we have enough housing available in our community? And this is where the supply and demand question comes up. And do we have equilibrium, or are we in disequilibrium? So on the next slide, we ask the question, with high demand for an insufficient supply, that's going to generate higher costs, overcrowding, and long commutes. So the next slide will tell you, this is an excerpt from the 2017 Housing Affordability
And this was a close
study.
race. There was a month or two where we were actually the least affordable relative to the income. So this was a good month.
At the moment in time
Yes.
that this study was done, Santa Cruz was the 4th least affordable place in the world. And
Behind Hong Kong, there were some heavy hitters there. I think Sydney, Australia.
yep, you know it.
And there's Santa Cruz.
There we were, top 5. So if we look
Not
at the
bad
next
for a hippie
slide,
town.
I'm sorry?
Not bad for a hippie town, right?
Not bad for a hippie town. There you go.
Who knew?
And what we find when we look at the numbers, when this analysis was done, only 14% of households in our community can actually afford a median-priced home, which at that time was $935,000. And
It's $920,000 this month, and not a whole lot better.
so it's a little bit less now, but it varies. But let's say, for talking purposes, only about 15% of the households can actually afford to buy a median home price here. The other interesting statistic about the renting on that same slide, you can see that almost 60% of the renters in Santa Cruz are spending more than 30% of their income on housing. So who can afford to live here? If you're a renter, you need an income of $9,100 per month. Did you hear that? $9,100 per month to meet federal affordability for Santa Cruz County's average $2,700 2-bedroom unit.
So that's a 6-figure income.
That is a 6-figure income.
Wow.
That's right. You do the math, that's about $109,000 a year. So if we look at the next slide, what we find is that the fundamental problem we have is that the vast majority of our workforce cannot afford to live where the jobs are, right here in Santa Cruz. And that creates a lot of negative impacts. This slide shows traffic. Everybody complains about traffic. That's a direct result of not having enough housing, affordable housing. So if we look at the next slide, we actually look at the jobs in Santa Cruz, the city. And inside the city of Santa Cruz, there are 27,700 what's defined as a primary job. So this is, someone might work 2 or 3 jobs, but their primary job is inside the city of Santa Cruz. Of those 27,700 jobs, only 7,700 of those are filled by people who live inside the city limits. So 20,000 people are commuting into Santa Cruz every day for their job.
Well, and I think an interesting corollary to that is the traffic over 17 is somewhere between 60 and 70,000 cars a day, largely commuters commuting out of Santa Cruz to be able to afford to live here. So you've got 90,000 cars by that rationale just that could be cut if you could somehow implement some of your programs.
That is the traffic problem in our community. This is basically defines it. So what does that mean? Why is it that way? Well, 12,000 of those commuters are commuting more than 10 miles. 54% of those people commuting into Santa Cruz every day are making less than $40,000 a year. The interesting thing about this is that you think that's a long ways. 10 miles is about Aptos, La Selva, kind of, that's maybe 10 miles from Santa Cruz.
Which is referred to as a small town about an hour south of Santa Cruz by some people now.
That's right. But 6,700 people, 24% of the people who commute into our town every day are commuting more than 24 miles. That is a long ways.
Yeah.
They are sitting in their cars a long time. So what kind of human impact does that have? The next slide kind of describes that. And so this slide just says for every 30 minutes, so if you're spending an extra 30 minutes in your car getting to work and an extra 30 minutes getting home, which, people who live in Watsonville, that might apply.
Yeah.
People who live in La Selva, that might apply. That adds up. That's an hour to your workday every day, an extra hour. That's 5 hours every week, 22 hours a month, 264 hours a year. That's the equivalent of 33 8-hour workdays every year, no pay. That's a lot of time. So how did we get here? That's the real question. The next slide kind of touches on some of the factors that we hear a lot about. So yes, Monterey Bay is beautiful. Everybody agrees. It's temperate, it's coastal, it's a gorgeous place, and everybody wants to live here. But there are other factors that are contributing to our housing problems. First, population is growing. Everybody knows that, but when you stop and think about it, it can be pretty scary. Since 1960, the world population has doubled. California population has doubled. But in that same time, Santa Cruz County has tripled. Since 1980, the county of Santa Cruz has grown by 86,500 people. Now, when you think about that in terms of a numeric value, you think 86,000 people. The city of Capitola has 10,000 people in it, 10,200 or something like that. So that is the equivalent of adding 8.5 cities the size of Capitola to our county since 1980. That's a lot of people. So that's not the only problem. We also have some regulatory environments that have created challenges for us. We have measures O and J that were passed about 40 years ago, which had a lot of benefits. It created the urban services line, it created the green belt around Santa Cruz, but it also required inclusionary housing to be provided. We've also increased our fees. So I think before the show started, Datta was sharing with me the cost of getting a water meter in SoCal right now, and I can't remember the number, but
Last I heard it was $43,500. And
so you think about what does it cost to even before you can even put a 2x4 up. It's going to cost you $43,000 just for a water hookup. Then you got traffic impact, you got school impact, and drainage mitigation, and so on. The fees have just grown so big. In addition to the high fees, it's a slow process. It can take 10 years. It can take a decade, even more, to develop land here and create more housing. For many years, our county didn't even have a housing element, which prevented us from obtaining
federal funds
for housing development. And our zoning, we had zoning that didn't really create affordable housing.
I think
So
this next graph was the most shocking for me.
Yeah, this next slide I think tells the whole story. This is a slide that tells you the annual number of permits granted in the county of Santa Cruz for housing. And back in 1980, we were granting almost 1,000 permits a year for housing. Today, that number's about 50. So we are just not building the housing that we need. We've continued to grow, but we're not providing the housing. The next slide kind of shows you just the housing production over the last little while inside the city of Santa Cruz. The upper line represents the number of total number of units, and the bottom line is just the number of units that are defined affordable. So that's at 80% of AMI, so area median income. So that's kind of where we're at. But the next slide we'll talk a little bit about how we arrive at determining how much housing we actually need in our community. So cities and counties, like where we live, they're required by law to plan to meet the housing needs of everyone in the community. These numbers are called RHNA numbers, the Regional Housing Needs Analysis. The challenge is that although the state gives us the RHNA numbers, the Regional Housing Needs Analysis numbers, to plan for, it doesn't require us to build any of this housing.
So do you know offhand what the RHNA numbers are for our county?
On the very next slide, it'll tell you.
Go.
The
Perfect segue.
The RHNA numbers in our county for this is the last housing element that comes out every 8 years. So in 2014, the number for our county was 3,044. So
And it's annually?
that is over the period of
Over the
time.
period,
So that's
okay.
3,000 between
Over 8 years,
2014 and 2023. So that's, you have to plan for that. But the problem with meeting the RHNA numbers, even if we were meeting these numbers, which we're not, it doesn't actually fill the gap that already exists. So people have taken a stab at what that gap might look like. That gap, some people say, is we need 12,000 units of housing in our county just to catch up and sort of balance the housing market.
Well, and I wonder if that even includes the 10,000 students that UCSC is supposedly bringing in and only providing 3,000 housing units for.
Well, I'm not sure where that $12,000 unit figure came from, but let's just suppose that that's a true figure. So you can see that even though we're required to plan, not build, for 3,000 units, we really need 12,000 units to catch up.
Wow.
So really, by 2023, we should be building about 15,000 units. Then you'd start to see a housing balance. Then you'd start to see affordability, more affordable housing, because we have the supply and demand problem. So for those who don't know, the next slide will tell you, how does housing actually get built? There are only two people that are building housing in our community. First, we have private developers. The other thing, we have nonprofit developers or builders. So private developers, you can see, they got to go to the marketplace and they got to get financing. Somehow they've got to convince investors or lenders that they will make enough to repay the loan and create a return on investment. So bankers, at the end of the day, the bankers hold the purse strings, and they get to decide whether or not projects are going to get funded. The nonprofit has the same problem. The only difference is they're not going to the bankers; they're going to the public for funds to make projects work. But they also have to be viable. They have to be able to, with the affordable rents that they're going to be limited to, they have to be able to pay for these projects. They have to maintain them, they have to manage them, they have to build them. And so this is a difficult proposition. Many people think, well, we could just build, but it's not that simple. It's really difficult.
So we do have some pretty active ones. I know Mid-Peninsula Housing is very active in the community. Can you name a few others? And
Eden Housing is another one that's big in our community. There's New Way Homes, which is Sibley Simon and his group are trying to build affordable housing in our community. So there's a few around. Private developers have risks and costs. They the next slide will sort of talk about some of the viability issues. Risks and costs are real.
Just backing up to the distinction between private developers and nonprofit builders. I do have access to some funds that get approached by some of the nonprofit builders who could actually, they don't just have to rely on nonprofit funds. They, in some cases, are able to, through government grants and such, make a project profitable for private investors. So
And that's fairly new.
yeah, that is fairly
Yeah.
new, and I think it's a good distinction, because I think that might be the engine that helps fund this, and that maybe citizens, investors who have a social drive can both make the money as well as cross that line, instead of just going to to private developers, and actually consider some of these nonprofit builders, because what I've been seeing is encouraging that might be a growing trend. So
That would be great. I think there's one of the things that COPA is doing is getting people around the table who have these different interests. And so we can talk a little bit more about that later. And maybe we should just jump ahead a couple of slides.
Sure. So we're on viability.
Yeah, we
Okay.
could talk about viability, but really these are sort of the factors that come into it. We've got, we talked about them a little bit earlier, but one of the other things is lawsuits. There's a developer here in town that's trying to build a development. They've been at it for 11 years. They have permission to build. The neighbors may sue over CEQA requirements, delaying the project for another few years and costing more in terms of litigation. And every time things like this happen, it just adds cost and makes these projects less attractive.
I see you've touched here about the I guess this is related to the disbanding of redevelopment agencies in 2011.
Yeah, and so funding for nonprofits, nonprofit developments, that's really where the affordable housing comes in, where we can deed restrict the units so that they are always at 80% of area median income or 50% of area, or whatever we want. But redevelopment was abolished in 2011, as everyone may recall. But that costs $1 billion a year. That was funding that is no longer available in our community. There were other funds from Prop 46 and Prop 1C. Those funds are gone. They're essentially completely spent. And many of our key federal programs have been cut severely between, over the last few years. Community development block grants are 27% down. Home is down by 50%. And then, not that long ago, we passed the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And unfortunately, one of the things that act did, it reduced the value of tax credit financing by 20%. So tax credit financing was one of the tools that nonprofit developers were able to use. They could sell these tax credits to investors, and they would get a return. And now that's becoming difficult because that value is down by 20%.
I think, there's a new development I've heard of that our fund is looking into, and it's the creation of these opportunity zones, where essentially you have abilities for, and this touches back on how private investors are starting to look at these, because you have tax-free, basically tax-free opportunities in the zones, and there are defined zones within the county of Santa Cruz that some of these developments. There's one on Ocean Street, for example, that happens to fall in one of these zones. So hopefully there's a tide turning, and hopefully we can get more involvement, because it does appear that the trend at the basically at the state level hasn't been a good one. So hopefully from the federal and from the private sector we can get a little.
We sure hope so.
A little, and that probably ties into your advocacy opportunities. So
Yep.
what are your specific efforts that are underway?
So what we're doing, what COPA is doing, and amongst its institutions, is we are currently asking all of our institutions to look at the land they own, and do they have land that's underutilized? Do they have land that could be used for housing developments? And some of our members, St. Stephen's most recently developed.
Up on High Street, there's a church that's also.
St. Stephen's completed a senior housing project, affordable, 100% affordable. They were working with MidPenn.
Now it's down on SoCal. Behind
That's on SoCal, just before 7th Avenue on the right-hand side.
It's a beautiful project. I've been there.
Beautiful project,
Yeah.
spectacular project. And they were able to use the land that they owned, and they were able to work with MidPenn in partnership. And now we have 50-something units of affordable housing, senior housing. High Street, Peace United, on High Street, Peace United, they have a piece of land that they're looking to partner with a developer to develop. And so we're going to all of our institutions, and some of them have land. I'm with the Resurrection Catholic Community, the Archdiocese of Monterey. They own a lot of land, And so what we're doing right now is we're asking all of our institutions just to inventory their land. We're not telling you have to do this, but we just want to know, what do we have? Some of our institutions are schools, Pajaro Valley School. What land do they own? And some of that, repurpose it.
I think by Harbor High School, there's some land that's potentially
could be reused
right there.
Yeah.
And I don't know why, but you touched on the Catholic. Somebody once told me the Catholic Church is the single largest property owner in the country. I don't know if that's
Wouldn't
true or not,
surprise me.
but so that seems like a good resource that could certainly be tapped.
Yeah, and we're not there are many institutions that are part of COPA, not just the Catholic community, but all of our institutions are being asked to inventory land.
Well, I think with these opportunity zones, I think increasingly I'd love to see more of that coming from the private sector. And so, what are the projects and policies that we should be on the lookout for?
Well, Measure H, which is on the ballot in November. Measure H is an affordable housing bond, essentially. It'll raise $140 million for three big buckets. You've probably heard of it. Affordable housing, number one. Number two, homeless supportive services, housing for the homeless, transitional housing, and then first-time home buyer program. So the bulk of the money will go to those three. All of it will go to those three. We're also looking at working with the county to update their housing policies, density bonus laws, and ADU, waiving the fees for ADU, accessory dwelling units. We're working with the city on their housing policies. They just did this big listening tour last year, and we're trying to implement some of the changes there. And then lastly, we also advocate for specific projects. So there's a big mixed-use development coming online at 17th and Capitola in the county. That's a piece of land that was owned by the redevelopment agency.
It's right behind the bus stop there.
Right behind the bus stop.
Next to Live Oak Super.
Yep. Everybody knows where it is, and that project is sort of underway. And of course, COPA is advocating for as much affordable housing in that development as can possibly be supported. There'll be some healthcare facilities there, and it'll be a terrific project for our community.
Well, and I think one of the things that people fear when development happens is that this is going to create traffic problems, and by the statistics that you showed with what was it, 20,000 commuters, low income commuters happening, it seems that your projects might actually take those ones off the road.
Yeah, that one of the great myths in our community and in many communities is that building housing will bring more traffic, and the truth is that it's a housing jobs balance problem. That in our area in particular, we have so many people commuting to the jobs that building more housing where the jobs are is going to reduce the traffic congestion. And this has been studied. There's a group out of Harvard, maybe not Harvard, my memory's a little fuzzy, but they looked at how many car trips a day do people who live in apartments take versus people who live in suburban homes. And we have a lot of suburban homes. And what they found was that people who live in apartments, they drive about 60% less than people who live in single-family residential dwellings. It's just a function of the type of housing they live in. So when we add apartments, or high density, higher density, maybe not high density is the wrong word, but higher density homes along our corridors, we will see a reduction in traffic. It doesn't make any sense, but that's actually what's going to happen.
Well, with the mixed use, hopefully some of the businesses that serve those people being right on the ground floor, additionally.
They'll be right on the ground floor, walking distance, walkable communities.
And maybe a few drones delivering their Amazon. That's another topic.
That's a whole other topic. We should save that for another show.
I think we should. I really appreciate you, the work that you're doing, and you joining us on the show. And keep up the good work.
Thank you.
All right.
My pleasure.
And thank you as well for joining us. We're glad that you cared enough to make it to the end of the episode. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for watching the BTS Presents show.